So we're very happy to have Cindy Blackstock here with us today. On est vraiment content d'avoir Cindy Blackstock avec nous.
So it's great to be here on Haudenosaunee territory and with all of you, because there's never been a time when First Nations children needed you more, and there's never been a time when there was more that you could do. This conversation is not so much for you and your role in the public service. It's for you as people who care about kids, as people who believe that every child should have the opportunity to grow up safely in their families, get a good education, be healthy and proud of who they are. It's about people who actually think that this country is about fairness and justice. It's about people who actually believe that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are more than an issue, have contributed more than they've taken, are wanting to see a world that's as just for others as it is for themselves. But that's going to take a bit of a courageous conversation, because I'm going to argue that we already know how to do all these things. The problem isn't that we don't know the answer. The problem isn't that the issues confronting First Nations children are complex. The problem is that we do not implement the obvious answers that are right in front of us. And I'm going to begin by talking about one of my greatest heroes. And that man, it was a public servant. His name is Peter Henderson Bryce. Who knows him in here? None of you do. Oh, you only know him because I told you about him, Darwin. You're cheering. This guy should be a Canadian hero. He was born in Mount Pleasant, Ontario, just beside Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. His father was a blacksmith. He came from a blue-collar family, worked hard in education, graduated from the University of Toronto when Canada was 9 years old. Quickly rose through the medical profession as one of its top people, not only in Canada, but in North America. Indeed, he was the president of the American Public Health Association, the founder of the Canadian Public Health Association. He was Ontario's first public health officer, and he's the reason why you have clean water codes off reserve and mandatory vaccinations. That all was written up by him during his tenure in the early 1900s. His health code was so well written that it was used as a model for other provinces and territories, and was also taken up in a number of the United States. He's credited for saving at least 15,000 people's lives, from stalling the trains that ran from Montreal to Ottawa, because there was a huge infectious outbreak of disease here. Had he not stopped those trains, many more would have perished. For those reasons alone, he should have been written into every one of your history books. But he was erased for what he did at age 51. He decided to take up a post as a chief medical health officer at the Department of Indian Affairs. And Duncan Campbell Scott, the top bureaucrat, and keep in mind it was Laurier who was prime minister at the time, the two of them asked him to go out and survey the health of these children in residential schools. What he finds is that the kids are dying at a rate of 25% a year. And if you track those same children over 3 years, 48% were dead. In the only school for which there were complete records, File Hills Residential School, for every 3 kids who walked in, only 1 would walk out alive. Bryce literally walked through graveyards to get to the front door of the schools. Now, the cause of death was tuberculosis. So some of you may be quite rightly thinking, well, others died of tuberculosis too, but not at these astounding rates. And what else did Bryce find? Well, he comes back to Ottawa and he says, medical science knows just what to do. And one of those just what to do is he noticed the profound inequality in the healthcare budget going to First Nations versus to other people. In fact, the city of Ottawa, where I live now, and then only had a population of around 100,000 if you were really generous, was getting 3 times more healthcare funding than all First Nations across the country. He said, even that out, and then do some practical things like stop putting sick kids in with healthy kids, improve the ventilation, feed the kids better because they're starving and their immune systems are going down. Don't exhaust them into slavery by having to do all this farm work and all this domestic work. Do those things so you can save thousands of lives. He was confident the government of Canada would do just that. I mean, who else wouldn't save thousands of children if you knew what to do? The cost of his reforms, $10,000 to $15,000. How much was the Canadian budget, you might ask? About $100 million in that time. And what was the response by the Canadian government? Well, first there was the usual iteration of all the good things that they're already doing for the Indians, followed by a quick no. Now, what does Dr. Bryce do with that no? Does he choose to remain silent in the face of the authority of the Canadian Prime Minister and the head of the Department of Indian Affairs? Well, first he thought he might see if there could be a response from all of us, the people of the period. He was convinced that people of that time would be as horrified as he was if they only knew what was happening. This is the front page of the Evening Citizen newspaper. The Ottawa Citizen newspaper, as you would know now. A similar story appeared in the Gazette and as far west as the Victoria Colonist. It was also in the Globe, the national paper. Keep in mind that newspapers were the ways that the people found the news in that day. There was no internet or Twitter. And this is on the front page. Editors would only put newsworthy stories on the front page, wouldn't they? And certainly only really newsworthy stories above the fold on the front page. And yet this story repeatedly featured on the front page of newspapers. No one knows exactly who leaked it, but Dr. Bryce is our top suspect. And Canada thought so too. It's a mistake to say that the Canadian government ignored his report. They did not ignore his report. They thought about it. They considered it. They knew what the consequences were. They did not like it getting out into the public, and so they retaliated against him. They cut his research funding. They denied him positions for which he was eminently qualified. And eventually they push him out of the public service altogether in 1922. And then what does Bryce do during this time? Well, he's talking up a storm. And people are listening. Here's the other thing. He was not alone. One of the top lawyers of that time was a man named Samuel Hume Blake. Does anyone know about Blake's law firm that's still around today? He was one of the 2 brothers that founded that. And he happened to be reading this newspaper article, to which he says, and he writes to the Canadian government and to leading members of the clergy, in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. Throughout the entire history of residential schools, there were people of all walks of life raising the alarm. This idea that people didn't know any better back then is completely wrong. Now, this raises an important question. What kind of environment is the public service today? And is it more apt to respond to a Dr. Bryce? Or is it more apt to retaliate against a Dr. Bryce? And what about us when we see the newspapers? We, the people of this period, and we see about the inequalities facing First Nations children. Are we more apt to speak up? Or are we just as likely to turn the page and not press our public officials, find something that we're more willing to take on? See, that's the challenge of reconciliation. It's not enough to know about the history. The question is, what did we learn from the history, right? And how did that change our behavior? Some of you know about the profound overrepresentation of First Nations children in child welfare care, and my work about trying to end the inequalities in federal services. For those of you who don't know, all the public services on reserves are funded by the federal government. all the public services for everybody else funded by the provinces and territories. And going back as early as Bryce's report, and in fact, he references reports by the Auditor General in 1904, Canada has known it funds those things for First Nations at far lesser levels than everybody else gets. Far lesser levels. And yet it's woven a narrative amongst the Canadian people, and thus many of the people who are bureaucrats within various levels of government, that First Nations people actually get more than everybody else, not less. So the problem must be that First Nations folks don't know how to manage their money because they're not taking advantage of all the good stuff we're doing for them, right? And I admit there are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who do not manage their money well. And I'll even say some of us are probably committing fraud. But I live in Ottawa. And I work in Montreal. Construction companies, anybody? City Hall? But when that's that humanization that Ellen was calling us to. When it's a First Nations person, it's generalized across the whole group if it's a bad characteristic. But when we see a white wrongdoer, they're an exception to the group. I found it so astounding in Ottawa as they were talking up the First Nations Accountability Act. They were going to pass this act to make us all more accountable. And that's at the same time that all that wrongdoing was happening in Ottawa and here in Montreal. But no one said, we need a white Francophone Accountability Act for finances before we give Montreal more money. That's what structural racism looks like. And structural racism also looks like this. These are the numerous reports documenting, and these are all have one thing in common. These are all reports commissioned by the Government of Canada. These are all reports that document the inequalities that First Nations children are getting in public services and the multiple harms that are resulting from them. They all have recommendations, and all of them were accepted with the exception of Bryce's report at the time. The recommendations were. But then they're never implemented. And then we get a new generation of bureaucrats wringing their hands and saying it's complicated, we have no answers. Problem with the public service is it's a forgetting public service, right? And we need to really learn how to be activators of how to get these recommendations on the books. In order to do that, and with the greatest respect to forums like this is not the place to learn how to do that. If you knew how to do that, you'd already be doing it. You have to go to kindergarten. You gotta hang out with kids. Because kids are experts in love and fairness. And when they see something wrong, they don't wring their hands, they don't strike a committee, they actually do something about it. And this is one of the kids who really inspired me a lot, Jordan River Anderson. Jordan River Anderson was just a baby born in Norway House Cree Nation. He is the result of ignoring all those different reports. Because he had to spend 2 years in hospital. His doctor, Dr. Brian Polstol, is actually now the current dean of the University of Manitoba School of Medicine. And I saw him just a couple of weeks ago. And he talks about how when things were ready for Jordan to transition into a family home, if he was non-Aboriginal, he would have gone. The government of Manitoba would have picked up the tab and that would have been the end of the story. All the services were there. But because he's First Nations, Canada says, well, we don't know if we want to pay for this. And if we do pay for it, what department's going to pay? And Manitoba certainly doesn't want to pick up a federal cost. So what we had is a bunch of buck playing. And in the background, we had government bureaucrats saying, we're doing everything we can to get him out of hospital. But we don't want to set a precedent. The floodgates argument, right? And I'm saying, what's the problem with the floodgates? If there's other kids that are trapped in hospitals, I think all of us in this room would be happy to have our taxpayer dollars used that way. But it's the mentality, right? The worry about opening up a floodgate, opening up a precedent. And so this little boy ends up spending 2.5 years in a hospital unnecessarily because of his race. He dies in 2005, as his sister says, of a broken heart. Because he saw other boys come into the ward not feeling very good, get better and leave. And he was better, and he was trapped there. And as Dr. Postal said, he was writing letters. The doctors were writing letters. The family was writing letters, trying to plead for someone to break out of this bureaucracy and just do the right thing. Take the risk of doing the right thing. Have the moral courage to do the right thing, just like Dr. Bryce did. That didn't happen. So Jordan's Principle came out of that. Jordan's Principle is about ensuring that every First Nations child can access every public service when they need it, without additional red tape related to their First Nation status. If there's a kid who needs a hearing assessment, they get the assessment. It's not who pays and all the rest of this stuff ahead of time. We have another problem, which is the overrepresentation of First Nations kids in child welfare care. For those who learned about residential schools and thought, man, I'd really do something if I was alive back then in 1996, which, looking at the audience, no offense, but many of us were, your time is now. You haven't missed the opportunity, because there's actually 3 times more kids in child welfare care today than there was at the height of residential schools. And the reason that they're in care is it's driven by poverty, poor housing, and caregiver substance misuse related to multi-generational trauma that Ellen was talking about. All things we could do something about. But all of those things are underfunded on reserve, right? So what did we do? Well, after Canada failed to implement the results of 2 reports, including one that had over 150 pages of spreadsheets documenting the inequalities, we thought, as a small little NGO, we needed to partner with the Assembly of First Nations and take them to court. So in 2007, we filed a human rights complaint alleging that the Canadian government was racially discriminating against little kids. Within 30 days, we lost all of our public money. And I think that they had hoped that we would go away, because that's generally what happens with Indigenous organizations. And they actually legitimized it. Now, we heard in back rooms, they said it was a reprioritization of funding, right, to different goals. But you know when you're cut, right? We were cut. But what they didn't realize, and what I didn't even realize, is that when there's that poem called Faith, when you step across that place where light leads into darkness, there will be something solid to stand on, or you'll be taught to fly. And for us, that came in a little envelope with pencil crayon on the outside. And inside it said, "Dear Cindy, here's some MUNY for the kids, love, Ella." And it was $1.67 from her piggy bank. Over the next 9 years of this litigation, in fact, it's still going on today, our biggest donors were kids. We never asked kids for a penny. But children did not think it was right for First Nations kids, their friends, to get less because of their race. And so when adults and human rights groups, they weren't there. They had normalized it themselves. They were more concerned often with human rights abuses around the world than racial discrimination against children in our own country by our own government. And so it was the children who led the way. They are the ones that you need to learn from. I'm going to show you a few of the things that we do with kids. So this is Spirit Bear. He was a teddy bear who witnessed all of these cases. We wanted to have something in the hearing room that reminded everybody of children. So I was given this little teddy bear, and I thought he was super cute, so I put him to work as being the witness. And one of the things that was interesting is we had this program called I Am a Witness, where we loaded up all the court documents, and we just asked the general public and people like yourselves to watch, not take a side in a court case. You're independent thinkers. You can look at the evidence like a jury would and make your own decision. And we invited people to come to the hearings too, but almost no one came. The first group to come was a group of high school students. And I still remember I was being cross-examined, and there's Spirit Bear and me in the courtroom, and we thought we'd be alone again. But in comes this high school student, and he comes right on over, and he says, "We're from alternative school, which means we get into trouble a lot." I said, "Good, so do I." And he says, "Sometimes we deserve it, but sometimes it's the systems that get in trouble. They need to get in trouble, but no one ever takes them on. But you are, and you want us here, so we're here." So not only did they stay that full set of 2 days, but they came back at the next set of hearings wearing I Am a Witness t-shirts that they had designed themselves, and they brought all kinds of friends. By 2012, there were so many children coming to the hearings that we had to book them in shifts. So you can imagine arguing this case as the government and turning around and saying, let's say, for example, first of all, they turned around and seen all adults like yourself in the room. Now imagine if you had to turn around as Canada's Council and see 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds. The power of that. Well, the bear took on quite a personality because the kids would come and get him. They would dress him up. He'd come back with fan mail. He'd come back with sunglasses. And this is him now. He's actually been made kind of a superstar. If you guys were a little younger, you would be knowing Spirit Bear right away. He has an actual honorary barrister degree from Osgoode Law School. He was admitted to the Bear by the Indigenous Bar Association. He is a member of the Ottawa Legal Society. He has a calendar and he has a book that tells the whole story of how children came around social justice. This is his book, and we actually have a teacher's guide so that we can bring it into the rooms and start with daycare. When you talk about building a public movement, you're thinking adults. I'm going to ask you to think of daycare. That's what I'm thinking about. I want to raise a new generation of Canadians who are like Dr. Bryce, who can see the injustice, who don't turn away, and who are compelled to act. And you do that at daycare. And you also do that with love and fun. Don't build a movement on anger, right? You come into the Caring Society's gatherings, we have glitter, we have teddy bears, we have cookies, we have cake. And it's not as if we don't talk about the hard things. We do. We talk about racial discrimination against kids. But we tell the kids it's important to know that stuff. We all need to know it. But the joy comes from being part of co-creating a society where every child matters. And that's something that's joyous. It's something that we should all feel proud of. It's something that should be fun. And the kids, there were so many kids coming to the courtroom that we actually couldn't fit them all in at one time. And one of the hearings was on Valentine's Day. So we thought, we're going to have a heart day. Who else needs Valentine's more than our elected officials? So the kids write Valentines to all the members of the legislature and the Prime Minister so that First Nations kids can grow up safely in their families, get a good education, be healthy and proud of who they are. And they put it in their own words, and the kids have a microphone. The rule of Have a Heart Day is no adults speak. Even the First Nations kids from Gittigan-Zibi do the opening prayer. They've been taught by the elders how to do it. So no adults, and that makes it a fun gathering right off the top, right? But then you might be wondering what kids could possibly know about this stuff. And what would they say in their letters? And I'm going to just tell you one. And it's a story that really mirrors Dr. Bryce's moral courage. A little boy who had autism, who was picked on a lot in school, had his head hoodie down. No one really wanted to be his friend. He just felt really alone. And he was in a classroom when they were going to do their Valentines for Have a Heart Day. And he wrote one out, but he throws it in the trash can. Teacher goes and gets it and unfolds it. And she says, "Why did you throw it away?" And he said, "Well, no one wants to listen to a kid like me." And then she told him how his letter could help thousands of other kids get proper schools, get clean water, be able to get help for their families. And he was silent for a minute, and he said, "Somebody needs me? Me? Someone needs me?" So he grabs his Valentine, gets on his jacket, and he goes up to Parliament Hill. He grabs the microphone, and he says this: "Dear Prime Minister, do you have a cat? I have a cat. He's black, and he's a boy, and his name is Micah, because I like collecting rocks." Then he gets right down to business. And this is what we do not do well either. Like children, cut to the chase, right? So he says, "If you do not build more schools, you're going to create a crime wave and lose all of your money. Because kids who can't get jobs, get a good education, can't get jobs when they're bigger, but they still need money. So some of them are going to have to steal it. And then people in the community are going to get mad because crooks are invading their homes." And he looks down at his paper again, just to make sure. And he says, "My teacher tells me you're in charge. So you better man up right now and build more schools," right? We wait way too long to teach kids about citizenship and to actually involve them. And some people say, well, isn't this political for involving kids in politics? And I said, of course it is. But we're not teaching them to be partisan. We're teaching them that children have a voice and it should be listened to by people in important places who can make decisions for them. We have Honoring Memories, Planting Dreams. We have all these things this year. And so you can actually get some hearts yourselves, maybe even at this gathering. You've got lots of paper and color. And you write a heart in memory of one of the children that Dr. Bryce tried to save. You put it up on a wall or you put it on a planter stick in your garden. And that act of planting is your commitment to the TRC's calls to action, right? Keep in mind that equity for child welfare is the #1 call to action that was engaged in that lawsuit. Jordan's Principles #3. The top 6 all have to do with kids, right? And you can see there, Spirit Bear and I, we planted this one over at McGill, actually. We have Bear Witness Day. Who still has their teddy from when they were a kid? Come on, be honest. Yeah. And like somebody told us at some point that it wasn't cool to hang on to them anymore. But Bear Witness Day is your day. The one you've been waiting for. So every May 10th, we ask children to bring their teddy bear to daycare, school, or you can adults to work. And you use that bear to honor Jordan River Anderson because his favorite toy was teddy bears. And then you also educate other people about Jordan's principle. So this is happening in mega ways all over the world now with Jordan's principle with Bear Witness Day. And the kids don't have walks, they have parades. Now, I don't know where that person is from the Postal Workers Union is, but we actually have a campaign where kids write letters and they walk to their local mailbox to mail them, right? One thing in common with all of these different campaigns we have, how much do you think they cost to participate? How hard are they to do? Are any of them things that you need to read up on or take a 101 on before you get engaged? No. And in fact, the Caring Society, that's one of the very key things we do is even though we're a broke NGO, we only have 1 full-time staff and 4 part-time staff. We never ask for money. We spend 0% of our time on fundraising. Because we have an ethic that children all should have access to our services. We are not interested in access to your wallet. We also have an Ambassador program where our teddy bears get hosted by kids, and then the kids have to agree to learn the local language, read the First Nations, Métis, or Inuit language to the kids. They involve them in all of the reconciliation activities that's in Spirit Bear's calendar. And this is one at a meeting with Trudeau, actually, because teenagers have adopted our bears too. We have a children's edition of a journal where we take our peer-reviewed journal, but we actually only allow children to submit and children to do the peer reviews, and they do the whole publication cycle so that they're learning about how to critically appraise literature. And they're tough reviewers, right? They got their own standards, but that's an example of what you can do, and it's free of charge online. And what about Bryce? Well, I didn't think it was right that he was forgotten. And so we have mounted a historical plaque in Beechwood Cemetery for him. And it recognizes this great hero. We did this with historians, with Marie Wilson from the TRC. Ellen Gabriel was on our committee. But interestingly enough, just over the hill from Dr. Bryce is Duncan Campbell Scott. And he already had a historical plaque that was glowing, which I know is a part of Western kind of culture, right? Somehow, have you ever read the obituaries? Like, there wouldn't be a Trump voter in the planet if everybody was actually like the obituaries, right? And I asked one of the elders, I said, why is it that these people build these huge monuments in the cemetery, right? I said, I don't think that helps if you've led a scandalous life. It doesn't matter how high you build that thing, you're still done for. He said, oh, you're thinking about it the wrong way, Cindy. He said, the big ones are to weigh them down. Right? So we went to Duncan Campbell Scott, and we actually revised his plaque. So it does acknowledge him as a Confederate poet, but it also has cultural genocide in the same thing. And all of that, yeah, look at that's history, right? All of it is now school curriculum. We've incorporated it into school curriculum, and I'd recommend you do that too. You got to grow the next generation of yous so that they're different from you. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to raise a generation of First Nations kids who never recover from their childhoods, and a generation of non-Indigenous kids who never have to say they're sorry. So it's an absolute delight to be here. One person might say, well, how do you measure success? Well, the kids won the case. And Jordan's principle has now resulted in over 80,000 services getting to First Nations children. But there's more work to do. We're not done. We've got more equality to get. Because for us, every kid is worth the money. Every single kid is worth the money. And there should be no room at all for any level of racial discrimination and provision of public services to little kids. None. Not a penny less, not half a cent less. These kids are little kids and they're worth the money. If we can afford a pipeline, we can afford equality. Thank you very much.